Author, finisher, and faith. The word author we're going to look at in just a moment. It probably has a little bit of a different meaning than what you think it has attached to it. At least it did for me, and it took on a whole new light when I began studying that particular word. Finisher also is a word that probably has a different meaning than what you might suspect. Some of your versions may have the word perfecter, and it does not mean the same as just being complete as we have in other passages. And of our faith, because the Hebrew letter is talking about staying faithful to a group of brethren who could have been discouraged by a lot of different things. And so when you think about the brethren that were being written to in the Hebrew letter, and particularly in understanding the phrase, there were a lot of things that could have discouraged them. But the writer is giving them purpose behind their faith, and that their faith is not to be one that just begins the race, but that finishes the race. And the Hebrew brethren are in a state of condition where they seem to be on the verge of quitting. But in Hebrews 5 and verse 9, we see this idea of author mentioned earlier in this book. This word is not used a lot of times in the Scriptures. One place where, if you think about just the English word author used in the Scriptures, another place would be in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where it says that God is not the author of confusion. That word author there was actually added by the translators. But this word that's used here in Hebrews 5 and verse 9 says that Jesus, having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. This particular word means that they are the causation of anything, that they are the one who initiates something. They are the source behind something. This word is used many times when it talks about, like Pilate speaking of Jesus, I find no blame, I find no fault in him. That's the word that's used in Hebrews 5 and verse 9. It means that he is the source. He is the one to blame. He is the one that you put the causation for our salvation upon. That is the sense in which Jesus is the author there. He is the one that these things flowed from. It is not the same word that is used in Hebrews 12 and verse 2 that was read for us. The New American Standard and the other one actually uses the word source. Hebrews 12 and verse 2 says, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. That word that's used there for author is a different Greek word that means leading or furnishing the first cause or occasion, one that takes the lead in anything. This word is often translated as being the prince or a prince. That's the word that's used here. Also, some places you may read the word captain, the captain of our faith. That's that word as well. What this means is not pointing to the idea of him being the causation behind it, but the one who is the prince of that or the leader of that cause. And so earlier in Hebrews, he says Jesus is the cause of your salvation. Here in Hebrews, he says he is the leader or the prince of your salvation. He is the one who is walking the course ahead of you that you are following behind, which makes perfect sense, especially when you think about him saying, fixing your eyes upon Jesus or looking to Jesus, who is the author, the one who is running ahead of you. And that's one of the things that you need in a race. You need those who are around you. We're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, but you need the one who is out in front, who shows you the way. And that's who Jesus is as the author and the finisher of our faith. And so that's what the particular phrase is talking about. When it says finisher, that word is different as well. This is the only place that this word is found in the Bible, which I was stunned by that, because I've always thought about that word finisher or perfecter as being the same as when we talk about something else being perfect and complete. But what the word actually means, according to Thayer's, is this: one who has in his own person raised faith to its perfection and so set before us the highest example of faith. That's a long definition, but it does talk about completeness, but it talks about the one who has brought it to completion. It's not about the process as much as it is the one who brings the process to conclusion. And so Jesus is the one who is the forerunner. He's out front, and he brings the perfect example of what faith is supposed to look like, which fits, again, real well with the context. Hebrews 11 is that hall of faith that we talk about so often. But every one of those people in that hall of faith had their own problems and difficulties, and none of them can provide for us the perfect example of faith, such as what Jesus does. And so that's why he brings that to a conclusion in that chapter. And so let's think about the Hebrew letter for just a moment. And we're going to be reading several passages from Hebrews As I said this a few moments ago, the Hebrew letter was written that the brethren might be encouraged. And when you go from chapter 3 to chapter 10, what's being emphasized is that it's not enough to have the kind of faith that starts, but you have to have the kind of faith that concludes the race. Hebrews chapter 3 talks about, being careful that you don't drift away. Chapter 4 talks about how it is that there were those who crossed the Red Sea and did all these things, but then when they came to the brink of entering into the promised land, they failed to enter into that rest because of unbelief. Hebrews chapter 5 talks about how it is that by this time you ought to be able to teach others, but you need to be taught again some of the elementary principles. Hebrews chapter 6 talks about how it is that once you've received this enlightenment and you've received all these great benefits from heaven, that if you fall away, there's no way for you to be renewed. Chapter 7 and 8 and 9 talk about the insufficiency of the things that may have actually been causing the Hebrew brethren a lot of difficulty. The Hebrew brethren would have been surrounded by Jewish people who would say to the Hebrews, how is it that you believe in this Jesus? Where is your temple? Where is your sacrifice? Where is your abiding city? Where are all these things? And the Hebrew Christian would have to say that I believe these things exist by faith. I don't see them with the eye. But the other Jews would be able to say, but I can see these things, and I know that these things abide. And so in 7, 8, and 9, he talks about the insufficiency of all those things that people could see with the physical eye. And so then when you get to chapter 10, he kind of brings this argument to a crescendo when he says this, starting in verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 10. He says, for you have need, but recall the former days, rather, in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with suffering. Partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations. Those were some of the ridicule they may have received from others. And partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition or to destruction, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. So then he has to go into, so what is faith? Faith is the substance of the things hoped for. It's the evidence of the things not seen. And then he says that it's by the faith that the elders obtained a good testimony. And then he launches into this great and wonderful chapter about what faithfulness looks like in the lives of other people. And so he talks about the elders of old. He talks about Abel, who went out and sacrificed to God. And because of that sacrifice, though, he was hated by his brother and lost his life. He talks about Enoch, who walked with God, and he walked with God so closely that God was pleased in him and took him so that he didn't see death. He talks about Noah and how it was that in a time where possibly they didn't have rain, or had at least never seen that kind of rain before, prepare an ark to the saving of your soul. He talks about Abraham leaving the land of his parents and dwelling in an unknown land, even dwelling in tents with the son of promise. Sarah was being able to give birth. He revisits and goes to Moses several times, and Moses is mentioned throughout the letter the most in talking about how his parents even hid him so that he wasn't taken when he was a child. He talks about how Moses saw the suffering of his fellow Hebrews and chose to suffer with them and then enjoy the passing pleasures of sin for a moment. And then he talks about Israel passing through the Red Sea and saving the nation. But then he brings it to a great conclusion in Hebrews chapter 11, and starting at verse 32, where he says, and what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to speak of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms. Moses did that. Egypt bowed down to him when they brought out the plunder when he left the land. They subdued kingdoms. They worked righteousness. You have people like David who did things like that. You have those who obtained promises, Abraham and others. Stopped the mouths of lions, people like Daniel. Quenched the violence of fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come to mind. Escaped the edge of the sword, David again comes to mind, and fleeing from Saul so many times. Out of weakness were made strong, maybe that's why Samson is mentioned. became valiant in battle. Gideon, remember, he didn't want to go at first, but then he became valiant. Turned to flight the armies of the aliens over and over again. You see the armies turning back. From even people like Jephthah, you see it. Women received their dead raised to life again. People that Elijah and Elisha dealt with saw those types of things. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings, scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were tempted, they were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. And then in verse 38, one of my favorite quotes from the whole chapter, of whom the world was not worthy. They were not deserving. They were not equal. They were not worthy to be even compared, put on par, to be mentioned in connection with these that we just mentioned. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, notice this in verse 39, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. And so what you see when you read through Hebrews chapter 11 is that you go through all those great heroes of the faith, and many of them received some promises, but none of them received the promise. Earlier in this chapter, it mentions how as they're wandering about, they're not actually looking for just that promised land, that land of inheritance, that thing that could be seen with the naked eye. If you go back to verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Moses himself, Abraham himself, all these great heroes of faith were looking for something else. Of Abraham, whose builder and maker is God. That's what he was looking for. And so all these great heroes of faith were looking forward to something else, which meant something better for each and every one of us. This reminds us of what Peter says in 1 Peter, when he says of the prophets of old, that when they would give these prophecies, they were searching what manner that they were speaking of. What are these things that we're talking about? And they were laying a foundation that they understood that they were not prophesying for themselves, but for us they were giving these prophecies. These words that were spoken were not for them. They were for all of us, that we might come to the thing that God has promised for everyone. And these things are not going to be seen with the naked eye. Jesus is the source of our salvation. He is the one that is the blame for our salvation, but he is also the forerunner. All these other people died in faith not having received the promises, but these promises only come through Jesus Christ. They don't come through the land. They don't come from even having your own dead raised back to life. They come through Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ is not there just so that you know where to begin, but that you know where to end. It begins and it ends with Jesus. And Jesus is with you all along the way. That's what's meant by that phrase, especially in the Hebrew letter. So let's think about it for just a moment then. So if Jesus is the leader and he is the perfecter, if he is the one who blazes the trail, but he's also the one that gives us the perfect example, then all these in Hebrews chapter 11 are not the perfect example. Think about Abel. Abel offered a sacrifice that was acceptable to God, and he was killed by his brother as a result. Jesus Christ offered the best sacrifice, and he was killed as a result. Enoch was one who walked with God, and God was pleased with him. Jesus walked with God, and God was pleased with him. And at the end of his life, Jesus committed his soul into the hands of his Father. Noah prepared an ark for the saving of his household. Jesus Christ prepared an ark. 1 Peter compares it to baptism and says that this ark is one by which all of mankind might be saved. Abraham was promised that in his seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Jesus Christ is the one who blesses every nation of all times, and not just one single race of people. Moses is one that was protected by his parents. Jesus was one who was protected by his father. Moses was one who gave the law and chose to suffer reproach with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Jesus gave up heaven and dwelt in tents among men, that he might sacrifice and give up all the pleasures that earth might give to us, that we might have salvation. Jesus is the perfect example of everything that those Hebrew saints could have not possibly ever attained to. He is the forerunner, no one else. These others give us encouragement. Jesus gives us the perfect example. And so when you go through the Hebrew letter, that's what the author is attacking, is that there's so many arguments that people may say to you. For example, they may say to you, so where is your high priest? I can go to the temple and I can see my high priest. But what does the Hebrew writer say about Jesus Christ? If you go to Hebrews chapter 4, in verses 4 through 16, or 14 through 16 rather. Hebrews chapter 4. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are. But notice this, yet without sin. Therefore, what does that mean for us? Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. In chapter 7 and verse 25, it says, therefore he is able also to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for all the people, for he did once for all when he offered up himself. So you think about the high priests of old. There were some good ones, but he also had some like Caiaphas, whose hands were stained with the blood of Jesus Christ, who put him to death. You had some horrible high priests. Jesus Christ was not someone who had to get up every day and make sacrifices for himself. He offered one sacrifice, and it was good not only for himself, but for everyone, because he was without sin and he was perfect. And when Jesus Christ offered his sacrifice, it tore down that wall of separation between us and God. And so I can come boldly to the throne of grace to find help because of Jesus Christ. I couldn't do that through some other high priest. I know that when I speak directly to God. I couldn't do that through some high priest. I know that when I pray to Jesus Christ, he's at the right hand of the throne of God. Some high priest wouldn't have done that. And so what is better? What you can see with your eye, or the author and the finisher? The one who blazed the trail and the one who showed the perfect example. Better also is Jesus Christ, because they could have said, well, we have the temple that is here. Where's your temple? Well, my temple I see by faith. Oh, of course, okay. And you can imagine the ridicule that they would have. But when you think about the temple being Jesus Christ, Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Now, this is the main point of the things we're saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. He goes on to develop this argument in chapter 9 and verse 11 when he says, but Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. And then in verse 24, he says, for Christ has entered the holy places made with hands, or has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. You had that original tabernacle, the big tent that would travel around with them. And that was only a shadow of what was to come with the temple. But even the temple itself was nothing but a copy, a furtherance, a greater manifestation of the tabernacle. But with Jesus Christ, he came with one not made with hands, one that was eternal. So yes, you can have your temple, but I have the true temple. You can have your shadow. You can have your remnant. You can have your masterpiece, your landmark. But I have the author and the finisher. That's what faith sees. They could have argued back then, so where is your sacrifice? My sacrifices are made by faith. When I worship, my sacrifice is the praise of my lips, my prayers. Okay? But you can't smell it. You can't see it. You're not putting your hand upon it. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. It's the substance of things not seen, the evidence of things that are hoped for. Of Jesus, it says in Hebrews chapter 9, in verse 13, For if the blood of bulls and goats and ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from the dead works to serve the living God? In verse 28 of that same chapter, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Jesus Christ was offered once for all. There's not a continual offering of these other physical sacrifices to God. I'm in constant communion with my Father because of the sacrifice that Jesus made. He is the high priest. He is the temple. He is the sacrifice. And because of that, everything has been accomplished to allow me to have this perfect communion with God. He is the source, Hebrews chapter 5, but he is also the one who is the forerunner. He has entered that place ahead of me that I might follow. He is the perfecter as well. They might look at others and say, well, what about your covenant? What is your covenant? We have these handwritten documents. We have this handwriting that was given to us. We have these stone tablets. We have all these things that we can look to of this covenant. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15 says of Jesus that he is the mediator of a new covenant by means of death, and that this new covenant is one that provides for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promises of eternal inheritance. In chapter 10 and verse 1, the law having a shadow of the good things to come, not the very image, but the shadow of the good things to come, can never with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make those who approach perfect. Verses 9 and 10, then he said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first, that he might establish the second. By that will we have all been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Why is Jesus superior? He is superior because all the things that others might rely upon because they can see with the eye. Jesus is the author and he is the perfecter. He is the forerunner, he is the source, forerunner, and finisher of all these things. And so it's about faithfulness in Jesus Christ that he's talking about when he refers to him in such fashion. What about the city? Hebrews 12 and verse 22 tells us in Hebrews 12 and verse 22 that we have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. Jerusalem was constantly taken, destroyed, and rebuilt. Taken, destroyed, rebuilt. Taken, destroyed, rebuilt. Over and over and over again. And where is it now? Is it the great glorious city of God? No. And the reason being is because that is not the city that we're supposed to be looking for. We're looking for a heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, the one where God himself is at, where Jesus has also forerun into. A better kingdom is even mentioned. In chapter 12 and verse 28, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. And so when we speak of Jesus, what we're speaking of is someone who is the ultimate example of what faith looks like. The New American Standard is the version that I like best when it says that we are to fix our eyes upon Jesus. It's not casting a gaze. It's not just looking upon. It's beholding. It is fixing your eyes upon Jesus. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, all these other heroes of faith, let us run with endurance. Jesus endured. The race that was set before us, I have come to do your will. He finished the race. The Hebrew writer says you have need of endurance, but Jesus endured. So we're to look to Jesus, fix our eyes upon him, the author and finisher of our faith, because he had joy that he was waiting for. He knew he was going back to the Father. He knew what was ahead of him. He didn't just look upon the things of this earth. He knew what was ahead. He despised the shame, which doesn't mean that he hated the shame, but that when he looked at the shame, it was one of those things that it meant nothing to him. It was something that he just had to go through in order to get to the joy. He despised the shame. And then he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, which is where we all desire to be one day, to see God face to face. That is the ultimate example of what faith looks like. Every other example had their faults, but not Jesus. That's why he's that forerunner. So what does that mean for us then? I want to conclude in chapter 12. And I want us to read verses 12 through 19. So since Jesus is the source, He's the leader, He's the one who gives the ultimate example, the perfecter, what does that mean for me? That means that I'm supposed to strengthen the hands which hang down. I'm to strengthen the feeble knees. I'm to make straight paths for my feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. I'm supposed to pursue peace with all people. I'm supposed to pursue holiness, because without such, no one will see the Lord. I'm supposed to look carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest there be any root of bitterness springing up, cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. And it's so very important that, as he says here, look carefully, lest you cause trouble. Don't do such things as that. Don't be like Esau in verses 16 and 17, who for one morsel of bread, because that's what he saw, a bowl of soup, a bowl of stew, that's what he saw. I'm hungry, I want this, I will take it. And he gave up his birthright, the thing that he could have waited for, that was so much greater. And he was a profane person. You know that afterward in verse 17, when he wanted to repent, he couldn't find a place for repentance, even though he sought it diligently with tears. In verse 18, we haven't come to the mountain that may be touched and that burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure that what was commanded. And so much as if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I'm exceedingly afraid. Even Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. That is not where we are. Because of Jesus Christ, not because of any other faithful of old, not because of anything else that was seen in the temple and the city and the nation and the sacrifices and the covenant, but because of Jesus Christ, we have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly, in other words, all the saints of all times, and the church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven. We've come to God. We've come to God, who it says is the judge of all. We've come to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, who is the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood that sprinkles, that speaks better things than that of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who speaks, therefore. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth. But now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this yet once more indicates removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace, by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. In verse 29 it says that our God is a consuming fire. He writes these things so that brethren might be encouraged. But the only thing that encourages us, or really encourages us the most, it's helpful and it's encouraging to look at brethren and to know about these great heroes of faith of old, this great cloud of witnesses. But brethren is so much more when we see the one who has run the race ahead of us and who has finished that race. And he didn't do it as these others. He did it as the actual promise himself in the flesh. And because of that, we look forward to the promises that come as a result of who God is and what he gave to us. Jesus is the author and he is the perfecter. He is the one to blame for all of our salvation, and he is the one that shows us the way and brings it to conclusion if we keep our eyes fixed on him. And so that's the question I want to leave with you this morning, is are your eyes fixed on Jesus? If you've lost sight of him, if you've been distracted by the things going on around you, you have a chance this morning to change. If you haven't started that race, Jesus is the source. He's the one who carries all the responsibility behind the idea of salvation. Come to him that he might provide it for you. If you're subject to the invitation, if we can help in any way, won't you please come as together we stand and sing.